Nairobi, 1985. As hundreds of women from across the world joined as a political force at the Third World Conference on Women, those from Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean convened a Third World Forum on Women, Law, and Development to organize and mobilize regional women's organizations across the regions. From this WLD forum sprung women's networks with the broad objective of mobilizing women's action regionally, exchanging knowledge and demystifying the law to build alternative feminist legal praxis to realize women's human rights. In December 1986, 52 women delegates from 10 Asian and 2 Pacific nations met in Tagaytay, Philippines to mark the birth of the Asia-Pacific Forum on Women, Law, and Development. And this is Herstory, celebrating over 36 years of activism, advocacy, and movement building to advance women's human rights and development justice in Asia and the Pacific. We are united by the belief that women's human rights and substantive equality can only happen when women and the most marginalized are part of feminist movements, drawing synergy from other movements to break barriers and lead policy reform and determine solutions. APWLD Secretariat chose Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia as its base because of its strategic location, cultural diversity, and availability of support from the Women's Program of the Asia-Pacific Development Center. Task forces and a working group were created to respond to priority issues identified from a series of consultations within the network. The Rural and Indigenous Women's Rights Task Force and Regional Conference in July 1993 in Madras, India, was key in analyzing how agriculture and rural indigenous women are affected by neoliberal trade policies facilitated by the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Such task forces allowed APWLD to effectively advocate for women in the international arena, contributing to the adoption of significant mechanisms recognizing women's rights as human rights. Among these were the 1993 political statement of the United Nations World Conference on Human Rights, which clearly announced women's rights are human rights, the Declaration to End Violence Against Women, and the formation of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its causes and consequences, with the first Special Rapporteur being an APWLD founding member, Radhika Kumaraswamy from Sri Lanka. In 1995, APWLD partnered with Asia Pacific Women's Action Network for joint lobbying efforts at the 4th World Conference on Women in Beijing. This conference marked a significant turning point for the global agenda for gender equality, as 189 governments unanimously adopted the Beijing Declaration and the Platform for Action, or BPFA, a historic consensus that is still considered as a key policy document on women's human rights and gender equality. These were direct results of APWLD's commitment to build a feminist legal praxis. In 1994, APWLD introduced Beyond Law, training sessions that explored the roles, usefulness, and limitations of legal strategies that went beyond law. In 1995, APWLD developed FLTP, or Feminist Legal Theory and Practice, its flagship training program. From germinating law reform processes on domestic violence and rape, the FLTP continues to strengthen and empower human rights activists and practitioners to effectively challenge discriminatory laws and practices in their countries. 1997 was a year of transition for APWLD. The Secretariat moved to Chiang Mai, Thailand. More capacity-building programs were developed to respond to the dramatic changes taking place in the region with the Asian financial crisis and around the world with the rise of neoliberal globalization. Pushing back against militarism, patriarchy, and fundamentalisms, APWLD extended support to grassroots women mobilization to build the capacity of rural and indigenous women to organize against religious extremist activities and caste and gender violence. In 2003, APWLD co-organized a planning meeting to bring international attention to the concerns of women human rights defenders and the need for their protection. Through joint global advocacy, November 29 was declared as the International Women Human Rights Defenders Day. The following year, the Indian Ocean tsunami affected several countries. APWLD raised funds for 6 member organizations and released a guide for ensuring a gendered response for natural disasters. APWLD continued to combat violence against women, publishing a guideline on feminist counseling for counselors working with victim survivors of violence. The organization also helped institutionalize the annual consultations between regional activists and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, bringing international attention and concretizing her articulation of the scope of women's rights in the face of interconnected and structural oppressions, from land disputes, armed conflict and domestic violence to trafficking and migration, cultural discourses and fundamentalisms. APWLD deepened its feminist analysis on how the nexus of patriarchy with militarism, fundamentalisms, and neoliberal economic globalization is responsible for gross violations of women's human rights and fundamental freedoms. It presented the detrimental impacts of trade agreements on women's human rights in the region and pushed governments to recognize the link between the trade union density and gender equality. At its 20th anniversary forum, it was noted that political repression was growing in the global south, with governments adopting repressive legislation and policies. As states impinged on civil liberties, APWLD affirmed the importance of a democratic system and the rule of law for the protection and promotion of human rights, with the feminist movements leading. A decade after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the region was faced with the prospect of another devastating global economic crisis. Even APWLD suffered financially as donor countries shifted priorities. APWLD reversed this as an opportunity to reflect, re-strategize, and reorganize our structures and programs at the beginning of 2009. Our belief that our movements create and sustain change was affirmed, and APWLD's work focused to foster our movements with strengthened capacity and leadership, strengthened knowledge, strengthened participation and advocacy, and a stronger institution. In 2008, APWLD strengthened its support for women human rights defenders and outlined how litigation, law drafting, and legal literacy can enable women to make systematic transformations in their communities and lives. In 2010, APWLD introduced its first community-led participatory research initiative on climate change to rural, indigenous, and migrant women, eventually leading to the creation of the Feminist Participatory Action Research Framework, which was developed from a deeply held belief that all knowledge is political and that local feminist movements must author their own knowledge and utilize it to bring about the changes they determine and address issues in their communities. During the 2012 Rio Earth Summit, governments agreed to develop sustainable development goals. APWLD's campaign focused on exposing the failure of neoliberal globalization and advancing a more feminist, just, and equitable development. Together with other diverse movements, including farmers, workers, trade unions, migrants, and indigenous peoples, we developed a model of development justice to redistribute wealth, power, and resource between countries, between rich and poor, and between men and women. APWLD created spaces for intersectional and intergenerational feminists and women's organizations from the Asia-Pacific region to come together in solidarity to learn, strategize, and mobilize for a new feminist future grounded in women's human rights and development justice, the Asia-Pacific Feminist Forum. Through the decades, APWLD has retained its dynamism in amplifying the voices of women and building grassroots movements. It remains a leading feminist regional voice as it was during its inception in 1985. APWLD believes that advances in women's human rights are achieved and sustained when autonomous feminist movements exist and have an enabling environment to work. With the climate crisis upon us, along with a global economy that rewards a few by keeping the masses hungry and oppressed, we continue to push for the rights of those in the margins of our communities. In the context of COVID-19, we highlighted the gendered impacts of the pandemic on women, especially rural, indigenous, migrant women, and women workers across the region. We consolidated our strategies to adapt to the pervasive digital shift through the creative use of online tools to disseminate our message, continue organizing, and mobilize cross-movement building. Through 4 sub-regional convenings in Asia, a survey from the Pacific, as well as consultations between every program and its organizing committees, APWLD established a new 5-year plan for the next 5 years. Since 1986, APWLD has been navigating the complexity and diversity of Asia and the Pacific region to build, sustain, and strengthen feminist and women's human rights movements in the region. Beginning with only 12 countries, it has grown to 30 countries and territories, covering 5 sub-regions of Asia and the Pacific. APWLD's story has always been one of resilience, passion, dynamism, and tenacity, as our members across the region face systemic crises that have, over the years, become even more consolidated and rigid. We remain steadfast in reclaiming ever-shrinking spaces for feminist actions. APWLD will always find bold, strategic, and innovative movement-building strategies to realize women's human rights and development justice.